Bright, unnatural fluorescent light flickered above, illuminating the words of the weathered page in such a way that they seemed somehow harsher. The turn of the page, breathing, and the din of the unerring hum from the lights above. A sigh. The seat creaks. Fingers are the first word of the first paragraph. Writing these entries is always an unsettling affair. The monsters within these pages are ones that I'd rather not revisit, but if only for the sake of my own reassurance that it wasn't all just a gory nightmare. I feel urged to continue my quest in cataloging all of the horrors that I've seen. As unreal as they seemed in the moment, the nightmarish visages of each of their grotesque forms, the cacophony of each of their twisted and haunted cries swirl around in my mind ceaselessly. For my own sanity's sake, I'd best get to recording. To start off, I hated coming out here away from the night. The night always did make me nervous. When I was younger, I slept with a nightlight. Later, when I was a young man, I never really went out alone once the sun went down. While I wouldn't call myself a city boy by any means, I certainly spent the majority of my life up until this point well within the confines of civilization. Bright lights and bustling city streets colored my childhood memories. But it wasn't just the dark that made me hesitate on nights like these. It was what that darkness could hide. I'd heard stories of an old man who'd spent the better part of his twilight years isolated in the cabin he'd built by hand off of the edge of town. Well, maybe a bit further than the edge of town. The hike to get there took a bit over 3 hours. I'd kept searching for some sort of beaten path to follow, but it seemed that not many people had bothered to make the trek to or from this guy's hut. Out here, so far from even the faintest hint of humanity, I'd never felt more alone. Before the cut, I would have said that being out here felt peaceful. Getting away from it all was a great way to reconfigure your mind and come back rested and readjusted. Nowadays, each step took me further away from relative safety. Albeit that's not saying much. There aren't really many truly safe places left out there. This guy, Gary, or something like that, had somehow been up here for what people say seemed like decades, with barely any interaction with others. Some say he'd been up there since before the cut. Walking through a forest alone, especially at night, was risky enough. But living out here that long? That just didn't happen anymore. I had to know who he was, if he even was still a he. The cabin wasn't much of a cabin. It more resembled a demolition site. I suppose there was enough left of the walls and ceiling to keep the rain out, but not much else. It was your typical squarish building. Looks like it had a room or two inside. I nearly left then, chalking up the rumor of Gary to be an old children's tale or maybe a story from long before. If anything lived there, I doubt I was going to get a conversation out of any interaction I had with them. When I stepped in, an immediate snap broke the silence. The damned place was full of what looked like animal bones. Rabbits, squirrels, and a ton of other small animals. Most were long rotted away. A few looked a few months old, but nothing too recent. I was right about there being a second room inside, but there was more of a jagged hole than a doorway. That room had bigger animals in it, and I could see the entire back wall was open to the forest behind it. Deer skeletons littered the floor. God, the scent of decaying flesh is still burned into my nostrils. I should have left then. Clothes, bags, shoes laid intermingled with those animal corpses. I had noticed that some of the deer skeletons had extra bones that didn't seem to belong to them. I really should have left then. I stepped through that pile of bones and out into the backyard of the cabin. The place was an overgrown mess, but what caught my eye was what seemed to be a person lying in the grass. I already knew what I was going to find, but I approached anyway. I guess that Gary was no more. But that wasn't Gary. That was a woman. She couldn't have been there longer than a few days. cause of death was very apparent. No animal I knew of could have left teeth marks like that. The hair stood up on the back of my neck. I'd seen enough to know that Gary was one of them, and he was still around. I started moving quietly back around to the side of the cabin. There was no way I was going back inside. I was suddenly hyper-aware of how open this field was. I crouched down, keeping myself low as I hugged the outer cabin wall. Every footstep I took sounded 10 times louder than it should have. Every rustle of the leaves in the forest around me made me believe that someone was out there watching. I came upon the front of the cabin and peered around the corner back at the front entrance. Nothing looked different. Then again, it's not like I took notes. I waited for a minute. Still nothing. Slowly, I started to move back down the path. If I could just get far enough away from here, I could start jogging. A branch creaked. I had enough sense to freeze, but every cell in my body was screaming at me to run. A chill ran down my spine, the cold night air feeling like the breath of a dead man. I slowly looked around. It was just my imagination. It had to just be my imagination. My eyes swept the path behind me and nothing. I let out a slow breath and turned. A low cackle in my ear jolted me awake. I tried to look around, but my eyes, my head. I moaned in pain as I wiped my own blood from my eyes. He was squatting over me. It was too dark to see him clearly, but I could tell that time hadn't been kind to him. His body was incredibly thin with papery skin to match. He was nude, I could tell that much, but frankly I was more enraptured by his eyes. This man, if you could even call him that, had eyes that were as dead to the world as a corpse. Yet beneath that glassy haze was a sickly intelligence that seemed to bear a hole into my very being. They were unnatural, almost compound in nature. I had never felt smaller. This is what I had imagined a rabbit feels once cornered by the fox. Holy insignificance expounded upon by the certainty that my death had come ringing at the door. Religion wasn't something that I'd given much thought to, but if there ever was a hell on earth, it was in those eyes. I stared deep into those eyes, a grotesque smell of decay washing over me. Time moved in slow motion. Why hadn't he killed me? What did he want with me? What was he going to do to me? What was he? As he loomed over me, a hand reached out and touched my face, drawing the finger slowly through the blood dripping down my temple. He brought the finger back to his mouth and licked it, his eyes never leaving mine. Fear dwarfed every emotion, every sense in my body. I was already dead. He reached out again, this time with a finality that made me close my eyes. I thought myself brave, but even I couldn't meet death's gaze. My hand was on my face, fingers covering my eyes. My breath stopped. A twig snapped in the distance. The man snapped a 180 in an instant, his fingernails clawing across my forehead, narrowly missing my eyes. He sprinted towards the noise, and my instincts took over. I don't know how long I ran. All I remember was the sound of my own heartbeat in my eyes. He had to be behind me, but I never stopped to check. I ran until I saw that damned little town of shacks. I ran and ran and ran until I collapsed on a road somewhere. I don't know what saved me. I don't even care. Gary. What a stupid name for the devil. Whatever hell he went to be turned into that was irrelevant. I couldn't even call him a cannibal because that would be to admit that he was a human. I tried to tell everyone, anyone, what I'd seen. They either didn't believe or they didn't care. To them, hell and earth were already one, I suppose. To look the devil in the eye was to be expected.